I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the College of Nursing and Health Professions, and I'll be talking about integrative reviews today. And we were, prior to everybody joining the room, we were talking that when I was a PhD student, I had a requirement to complete a review paper for my qualifying exam. And that's sort of how I started learning about review papers. And it sounds like at the College of Nursing and Health Professions, excuse me, doing a review paper for a qualifying exam is by discipline, so it's not a requirement for everybody. But I think this will be a helpful presentation, and if anybody has any questions for me along the way, I have my chat box open, so feel free to drop me a note. So I think that you are likely here because you want to write a review paper. This is a great time to write a review paper since we can't be collecting data out in the field right now because of the pandemic. And hopefully I could give you some tools today on how to embark on completing a review paper. I do have to say review papers are not easy. They take a lot of time and you know, it's a lot of work, but there's a lot of values to review papers. You get to synthesize the current topic of your interest that has been published in the literature, help you identify gaps in the literature, and it is an effective way to target research funding. So throughout this presentation, I'll be talking about a couple integrative reviews I've worked on. And the one that I had worked on for my dissertation paper, that was very specific to my population of interest, nursing home residents with dementia and persistent vocalizations. So residents who are yelling, crying, laughing out loud inappropriately, and disturbing other people. And so by completing an integrative review, I was able to identify that there's only 8 papers that are very specific to this vocal behavior, and the rest of the literature lumps together all the behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia, like aggression, agitation. And so with that paper published, I am able to cite it in a grant that I had recently submitted to show that there's only been one intervention done in this population. So it's excellent to be able to really review that literature and then have a publication that you could cite moving forward of why it's so important for you to do the work in this area of interest. So there are a ton of different types of reviews. This paper might be of interest to some people. It was published in 2009. It talks about 14 different types of reviews, and it goes through different strengths and weaknesses, and as well as overlaps within the reviews. Now, this is not all inclusive though. I think it's a good starting point to look at. I've listed the types of reviews that they discuss, but it's not all inclusive. So they do talk about literature reviews and / narrative reviews, which are essentially the same thing, which I think is a common terminology for people. I think that people probably have heard about systematic reviews very frequently, as well as scoping reviews, which I've noticed that there's a lot more in the literature these days around scoping reviews. One type of review that I'm working on right now is a systematic review of systematic reviews. So there's very specific methodology involved with that, and there's a paper on it, and so that's not included. So I think the world of review papers is constantly evolving. And of course, you notice here that integrative reviews is not on the list, and that's really what I'm focusing on today. So this paper by Whittmore and Knalf, this was published in 2005, and it's still the most prominent resource used on integrative reviews. And so if you are completing integrative review, I highly suggest following their methodology in here, as well as citing this paper. And I'll be going through the 5 steps of review as we move along. This is the dissertation paper that I mentioned that I had published, and it definitely started in one way. And by the time the reviewers got their hands on it, and I really dove into what is an integrative review, how do we make this as clear as possible, I think I have a really good handle on it. So I will be giving some examples of this paper as we move forward. So deciding on an integrative review, this is a popular type of review in nursing and health professions. And according to that Whittmore article, and as far as I know, this is the broadest type of research review when looking at the literature. But as I said, things are constantly evolving. And this type of review allows you to have a wide range of purposes when you go into the literature. So you could define concepts, you can pull out how people are defining concepts, you could review theories, which when you look at systematic reviews, theories are not being reviewed at all. It's usually randomized control trials. So this really allows you to look at different types of literature and to review the evidence to date, and also allows you to analyze methodological issues on your topic if that is what you're interested in. So essentially you could go into an integrative review knowing that you have several interests that you want to pull out of the literature, which might be different from other reviews when you just have one research question. And then this allows you to have the potential to have a really comprehensive review in a publication. So some strengths that this type of review allows you to summarize both the empirical and the theoretical literature if you want to include their theoretical literature, as I was mentioning. And this type of review allows you to combine the diverse methodologies that might be in the literature. So your phenomenon of interest, there might not be a lot published on your topic, but the publications might be very varied. You might have experimental, non-experimental, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods. There might be a whole bunch of different types of literature, and an integrative review will allow you to look at all of those together in one review. So the first step of an integrative review, and this is following the Whittmore and Knalf paper, but this is also similar to what you find for systematic reviews as well, is that there's a problem identification stage where you are coming up with your clear identification of the problem that you want to address in your review, and you decide what your variables of interest are and your sampling frame. And all of this is done ahead of time before you really start your review, because you want to have really clear focus and boundaries, because when you get into the review, you could have hundreds or thousands of papers that you have to shift through and trying to figure out what actually meets your criteria. You're going to want to fall back on how you designed that review in the beginning. And so this is just a short example from that dissertation paper that I mentioned. So the whole background of my paper is talking about the problems of nursing home residents with persistent vocalizations, how it could be exhausting for them to vocalize all the time, disruptive for nursing home staff, and that we really are, unfortunately, we use medications to sedate these residents, and we know that medications have poor adverse effects. And so I'm looking in the literature to find out, essentially my goals were, how can we improve the outcome of care for these residents? How can the literature inform our current practice? And then just understanding the literature in general on this phenomenon to tell me next steps for my investigation. And then you could see that I have here, I had not only my research question to examine and report the available published research, but I had three specific objectives. I wanted to know how persistent vocalizations were labeled, defined, and classified. And I will tell you that persistent vocalizations is terminology that myself and my mentoring team are using and had developed, because that terminology is not in the literature. What we find is problematic vocalizations, disruptive vocalizations, and so forth. And it really has a negative connotation, and that we have to realize that these vocalizations are a way that people express themselves versus them doing it on purpose, and that their vocalizations are problematic. So we've tried to change the terminology around this, but we had to know what's in the literature, how it has it been defined and labeled, what tools have been used to measure persistent vocalizations. And that was important because I was looking for my dissertation study, what tools would I use to measure this behavior? So it's me delving into the literature to find out what's in there. And then I was really interested in what interventions have been used to manage persistent vocalizations, because even though my dissertation study was observational, I already knew I had an interest in developing interventions in the future. So I wanted to see what's in the literature. And so I'm going to, later on in the presentation, I'm going to come back to these three objectives, but this is just to show you how you can have very broad interest when you go into the literature, but structure your review in such a way that you identify this information, if it's even in the literature. And so the second stage of a literature search is to have your well-defined strategies so that you do not miss relevant literature. And so early on, I definitely had consultations with librarians to make sure that I was coming up with the right search terms, trying to understand the best way to do a search. And so that has informed my current work when I'm working on reviews. And then when you're developing your search strategy, you want to document for yourself and your team what your sampling decisions are. And then in your paper, you want to be explicit and justify what your decisions are for why you've included or excluded decisions, what population you're looking at. And then you want to be able to document in your method sections of your paper, your search terms, your databases that you used, additional search strategies. So this might include looking at reference lists of the publications that are included in your review to see if anything else is pertinent. And then what your inclusion and exclusion criteria is. And this, I want to stress, is a very important area to make sure that you have it well documented as you go along so you don't lose sight of what you're working on. But also, when you do a review, it's still research, and it has to be able to be replicated by other people. And I do want to give an example. I'm currently reviewing a systematic review for a pretty prestigious gerontological peer-reviewed journal. And the systematic review topic is awesome, but I can't replicate their search. I can't understand, and maybe it's just the way they wrote their section, but I can't understand. They gave details on their search terms, and I thought that the number they reported was very low, maybe like 30 articles. And then I took those search terms and I plugged them in to one of the databases that they said they used, and I got over 1,000 hits. So I'm not sure how they had used these terms. And then it's just very convoluted how they explained it. And so for me, that's a fatal flaw. We can't publish a paper that has these flaws in it unless, of course, as I said, it might be that the way they explained it is not clear. But in your methods paper, it should be super clear. It should be replicable by other people. And then your inclusion and exclusion criteria should be very specific so other people understand why you selected a paper to include or exclude. Again, in this paper, I don't understand some that I'm reviewing. I don't understand some of their inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. For instance, they said they were only using papers from 3 continents, but I wonder why they're not using papers from other continents. You know, they don't give a reason. And is it because practice is different in other places? You know, they might have a very valid reason, but if you're doing a review, you really want to thoroughly review all the literature. So that is one of my critiques. So the beginning part of your review is very important, is my takeaway. And making sure that you have really good documentation of everything that you've done to get through your review, because you're going to want to have that within your method section. And then this is just an example from that dissertation paper. You could see that we gave the date of when the search was completed so that reviewers or anybody reviewing the paper knows when we looked at literature up to what date. We had used 4 databases to search for articles. It's pretty common for people to use 3 or 4 databases. I don't see the value of doing 15, 30 databases. It just, that seems too much. But consistently in the literature, you'll see 3 to 4 databases. And then also adding what we have also had in our search criteria. So we're just reviewing papers in English, and then you can see my search terms, which were published in the paper, and then so on. You would see exclusion criteria. So then once you do your search and you have hundreds or thousands of papers that come up, how do you manage this? Because all these papers are not going to be pertinent to what you're interested in. They might have a key word that hit in your search that is of interest, but it really has nothing to do with what you're interested in. And so how do you manage all of this? And in the past, I have worked on systematic reviews where we kept everything in an Excel sheet, and that was fine, but sometimes it's very cumbersome. And so as we move along in time, people are developing software to assist with reviews. And I have this website here from the University of Tasmania, and the library system did a really nice job of reviewing these 6 different types of software. And so if you're interested, go check that out. The only ones that I'm familiar with is this one, the free one, Ryan, which is in the bottom left-hand corner. I did look at that one, but I thought that the interface was very, it was very messy. I didn't find it easy to use. And what I've worked with in the past, and I'm currently working on with Roseanne and Elise and Ellen Bass, we're working on an integrative review. We've been using this software called, it's either pronounced Covidence or Covidence. I'm not sure the proper term, but this is an online software that we have been using, and I find it to be super simple to use, very easy to navigate. I have, coming up, I'll have a slide on it, and at the very end of the presentation, I'll walk you through it so you can see what it looks like. But some of the points of interest is that when you are doing your search and you have, let's say you have 500 papers that come up hit in your search, you can, and let's say you're in PubMed, you can export those citations into a reference manager, such as RefWorks or EndNote. I tend to use EndNote. And then you can upload that into the Covidence software. And it is pretty easy. Each time I do it, I just have to Google the directions to remind myself, but it is pretty easy, even if you're not too tech savvy. And then you have everything, all of your data points within the software. A couple tips I've learned through using the software and doing some Googling and watching videos is that the software, it's not as strong in picking up duplicates. And you will have, if you're using multiple databases, you're going to probably have a lot of duplicate papers that pop up. And so I've learned that it's actually easiest to get rid of the duplicates in EndNote first. And EndNote still doesn't remove all the duplicates. So then once you pull it into the software, then you could remove the rest of the duplicates. I hope that makes sense. But when you're looking at multiple databases, you might have the same paper pop up in 3 databases, and then you have to remove that from your final count. And so that's just keeping good track of your numbers and how many papers you have. But once you pull it into the software, then you could start the screening process where you review the abstracts as stage 1. And then stage 2 would be reviewing the full text. And then the software can assist you with data extraction if you want it to. I still tend to do the data extraction in Excel. And then when you're done, you could export all your information to different common formats. And this software is being used by the Cochrane Review. So it's a really well-known and well-used software. And so this is just a screenshot of the software. And so you could see that it's an online software. So purchasing it, you would get an email link, and then you send the email link to your team. You invite your team to join. So if you have 5 people on your team, you send them an email, and then everybody can access the software online. It is a yearly purchase for use of the software. So if you're thinking about doing a review, you might want to add that to a grant that you're writing, or see if you're working with faculty, if they have funds to purchase it. It's under $500, so it's somewhere between $400 and $500 to have access for a small team to do up to 3 reviews in a year. And then if you just wanted to do 1 review, it's even less. So in the website talks about the price. I'm not here to sell the product. I'm just letting you know that this is one of the products out there that I like to use. And so you could see in this top row here that's your area where you import your references, and it will tell you how many duplicate articles that it removed. As I mentioned, sometimes it misses some, so you do have to do a hand search as well. And then something that the article from Whittmore and Knalf does not discuss is the rigor of doing the review. And so you should have at least 2 people who are blinded and are looking at each title and abstract for round 1. And this software allows you to do that. So you could set it up so that 2 people are doing the review, or you could even if you just wanted 1 person. But I think if you're trying to publish a solid review, I would recommend having at least 2 people. 2 people to definitely review each article is what I'm saying. And so for rounds 1, you would check the title and abstracts to see if they meet your inclusion criteria. If you're not sure, you would push it on to the final screening where you actually look at the full text. If you're looking at your title and abstract and you're like, oh, this is on mice and I'm interested in humans, then right away you could totally drop that article, and the software will keep track for you who drops what. And then if there's any disagreements, so this is why it's good to use 2 people, if there's any disagreements, then the software tells you that somebody said, yes, include this article, and somebody said no. And so then you could work with your team to decide whether you're keeping it or not. And then stage 2 would be the full text screening. So if you think you're keeping these papers in, you look at the full text to make sure that it doesn't align with your inclusion, exclusion criteria, and it's what you really want. I do have to say sometimes full text papers, we think we want it in the paper, and then later, next step, when we extract data, we might find an error that we really don't want it. But the full text really helps you go from hundreds of papers all the way down to hopefully a manageable amount. And so it's all easy to be done in the software. Any questions so far? I don't see any in the chat. This is an example of a Prisma diagram. So this is what you're going to want to display something like this within your publication. And so you could see from my dissertation paper, we started with the 624 articles. That was from the 4 databases. And then as I was saying, record keeping is really important. So you want to tell your audience how many duplicates were removed. So we had 259 that were removed. And then how many did we exclude based on title and abstract. And then how many full text articles made it that we were actually looking through the full paper to see if does it meet our inclusion exclusion criteria. So we had 50. And then when you look at those 50 full text, how many meet your inclusion criteria? And for this particular paper was 8. And so this is as I mentioned, a phenomenon that not many people have published on. So it makes sense that there were only 8 papers. So now you figured out how many papers you have. So let's say you have 8, maybe you have 30. Well, how do you evaluate this data? And for the Whittmore and Knalf, and similarly, if you have a systematic review, or more so if you're doing a systematic review, you have to consider what quality scores you're going to give to literature. For an integrative review, because the types of articles you're reviewing are so dissimilar typically, you might not be able to use just one quality score. And I'll give an example to make this a little clearer. So if you're doing a systematic review on randomized control trials, then there are quality score tools that you could use so that you could rate how well these randomized control trials are explained in the literature. So was there rigor? And so forth. And so the tool helps you decide, and sometimes there's so many tools, there's over 100 tools out there for quality appraisals. So you have to decide what tool you're going to use. Some of them give you a summary score. And so let's say if it's 1 to 10, 1 being that the paper is very weak, 10 being that the paper is very strong, you can include that in your data analysis. The second bullet point that I have here from Whittmore and Knalf is that it might be reasonable to evaluate quality sources of just the outliers, because it might be very difficult to evaluate a qualitative paper to a quantitative paper to a mixed methods paper to a case study. And you have just so many different types of literature. So, but this is something that you and the team would decide as how you're going to rate the quality of the papers you're using if you're going to do that. And then for people who are interested, this is a popular tool that is used, the CASP tool. And this is it stands for Critical Appraisal Skills Program. And this is just a screenshot, but you can look at the website. They have 8 different appraisal tools, some for systematic reviews, randomized control trials, and so forth. And they have the tool that you could download for free and use that as part of your review to evaluate the literature that you're looking at. As I mentioned, there's over 100 different types of tools, so you have to figure out what works best for you. This is just one example, and this is something that I had used on a systematic review. And so this is just an example that we had done a systematic review on all qualitative descriptive studies that were published in 1 year. And on the right hand of the screen is the table that we had in the paper where we used the CASP tool to appraise the literature. And you could see, you know, there's questions like, did the researcher justify the research design? And then we could say yes, no, or could not determine. And these are all qualities of a good paper that you hope is there, but they're not always there. And so this might be of interest depending on what type of literature that you're looking at, that you might want to use something like a CASP tool. And then stage 4, this is where you extract the data from. You have your final papers, you're going to extract your data, you're going to code it, and you're going to summarize it. Think of this as a qualitative exercise. So you're looking at these word texts and you're trying to figure out where the similarities are, where the differences are. How can you take all this data that you have from the papers and tell a story that would be of interest to the readers of the paper and to help move the science along? And so within the Whittmore and Knalf article, they talk about the constant comparison method, and that is used most often in grounded theory, where you have one data source and you're constantly checking that data to the next data case, to the next data case. So you're moving back and forth, trying to analyze your data and identify what the themes are and their relationships are. And as I said, this is really a qualitative exercise, and it's an iterative exercise. And so I'm going to give an example of this, working on this wounds and dementia integrative review with Roseanne, who's on the line here. And we had done those steps that I mentioned before. We ended up with 26 papers. We had extracted all of the data into an Excel sheet. And so we have our categories on top of what we were interested in. We want to know study inclusion criteria, total sample size, description of dementia diagnosis, and so forth. And this is a really huge Excel sheet, so it's really hard to manage. How are we going to tell a story based on this data that we have here? And so with me playing around with the data, I started making my own Word documents, and I was I guess just to mention, I do a lot of qualitative research, so for me this feels natural. And so I started making a Word sheet, and then I would make things on paper, and I would try to figure out what's the story. We came into this paper with some specific objectives. We wanted to know what is the setting where people with dementia have wounds that are being cared for? What kind of wound care interventions are being used? So we had our objectives, and so I'm trying to figure out, how do we tell a story and what patterns are we seeing? So doing it in sort of a way where I could see it in a smaller amount of data was helpful. And then moving it forward, and we're still working on finalizing the paper, but this is an example of what a table of evidence will probably look like in the paper. But this is how I was able to do a visualization of the data where we could do additional comparisons and look for themes. And so just to give one example, like the further down here, or column 3, where it has pressure ulcers, was that one of the outcomes of the study? Now I could look through the 26 articles and look at my columns and see how many people had wounds as part of the language in their research question versus how many people only included it as an outcome in their study. So this is a way where we could do a quick look. We could also do a count. So I could say, and this number is not accurate, but just off the top of my head, let's say 15 articles had pressure ulcers as an outcome of the study. And so this is a place in qualitative research where we can use numbers, and with your reviews, people do tend to summarize with numbers, where other types of qualitative methodology, it wouldn't be as common. But here we could say 10 of these papers were published in North America, 8 in Asia. Our sample size ranged from 56,000 to 1 person in a case study. So we can make these comparisons. And so it's helpful to have some kind of data visualization. And that is actually the last and the final step of Whittmore and Knalf's methodology, is step 5, where you interpretation and presentation stage. And so having this data display, as I was mentioning, allows for patterns to emerge and for you to see relationships. And it's really that starting point for interpretation. And I tried to start writing up the findings, but really couldn't until I had that solid table of evidence where I could review all 26 articles at once and see where the patterns are. And then in this final, and other people do different things. You might see graphs. You don't have to stick to a table of evidence, but I think that's most common in the literature, that you will see people using tables of evidence. And then this is where you draw your conclusions when you're writing up your paper. And then you have to make sure you have a discussion on your limitations of your own review. So not just are there limitations of the paper you reviewed, but what are your limitations? And for us, it might be that we have missed some papers based on our inclusion criteria. And then I wanted to show, this is the table of evidence from the published dissertation paper. And when I displayed my findings, they are based on the table of evidence, but also those 3 objectives that I showed you early on. And so I was really interested in what are the labels for persistent vocalizations, definitions, and categories. And you can see in my table of evidence for each of the 8 papers, I have it listed there, whether we have that information or not. And then within my paper, that ended up being one of the themes, one of the main categories that I was looking at. And so I have that as a header within my paper. And then I have a summary of what everybody said. And essentially, we're using all different terms. There's no consistent definitions. And people are usually using aggressive or agitated categories to define vocalizations. And then earlier on, I mentioned I was really interested in what are the tools to measure persistent vocalizations. So then I have a header based on that. And I was interested in how many intervention studies there were, and there was actually just 1. So it's not even, its own column in the table of evidence, but I have a header that discusses the 1 intervention and summarizes how we don't have other interventions in the literature. So any questions on that? I know that was a lot of information. I think one thing I will say is it definitely takes a lot of time. This could be months or more than a year to get an integrated review done and published, or not even the published part, but written, analyzed, written, depending on how many papers you have to start with in your topic.
Hi, Justine, it's Bob. Enjoyed the presentation. You did a nice job of going through the rigor, and as a journal editor, that's one of the things always when someone submits that you really need to, and the reviewers need to sort of, and I think the readers need to appreciate, all that you've done to really try to provide, for lack of a better word, perhaps an accurate assessment of whatever. And just a couple quick questions. One, so for an integrative review, does the author or authors sort of specify the scope? In other words, as I understand it, you could really look at theoretical, you could look at methods, you could look at the actual evidence. And in your experience, is that something that may vary and is sort of defined by the people doing the review in terms of what will be reviewed?
Yeah, so when looking at a paper, that should be in the methods section, and right before the inclusion and exclusion criteria, there should be mention of what is being looked at and a justification if need be. Yeah.
And then,
oops, sorry.
Well, go ahead.
I think it goes back to that critique of how reviews can be biased, because the author might be like, oh, I just want to look at theory papers, and oh, I'll throw in a couple qualitative papers, but you really have to have a rationale for why you're doing what you're doing. And as I said, to be able to justify and have your work replicable as well. So you really do have to have all those things defined within your paper.
And just one more, I'm going to give you my impression. You can tell me if I'm not quite on target. My sense is that scoping reviews tend to focus on what do we know about a topic. So as opposed to maybe a systematic review where you might even do a quantitative analysis of the aggregated results, that scoping reviews, at least my impression when having read them, is that it's more an idea of here's what's been done, even though it may be a bit disparate, meaning some is qualitative, some is descriptive, some is. So I was just wondering, how would you maybe make that distinction between scoping and integrative?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I was actually thinking on that earlier too. I have personally worked on one scoping review, and that I was not a lead author, and there are a lot of authors, and it was much broader. So I think that might be one distinction, where in integrative review you have your specific objectives, you're more narrow in what you want to find. This particular scoping review that I worked on, we were looking at determinants of behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia, which was so broad. There were thousands of papers in that review. And everybody was on the team was broken into pairs. And so myself and my colleague, we had 1,000 papers that we had to shift through, step 1 and step 2. So looking at titles and articles, and then looking at the full paper. And then because there were so many articles that still met that scoping review, what the lead author decided to do, because we did a quality appraisal, was that in the publication, they only included the highest rated paper. And so that was the only way they can make it really manageable, because it was just so broad. Whereas this integrative review is more narrow, and you have more of a research question. Maybe you're identifying more gaps in the literature. Whereas the scoping review was like, hey, what are all the determinants out there? And make a portion of the paper said women have these symptoms more often, and I don't know. Hopefully that helps. I think.
It's Justine and Bob, it's Roseanne. So I guess, yeah, I think there's a lot of almost some overlap between scoping and integrative, but my interpretation, and I could be wrong, is a scoping review is a little bit more subjective, and an integrative subjective in the evidence that you wind up showing, writing about. And the integrative review is a little bit more, well, is objective, because you're really sticking to the search criteria and the, but it's different than a systematic review, because you're just not looking at published RCTs, you're looking at other types of evidence as well in an integrative review. And systematic reviews are hard to do, because you really need to have proven interventions, or there needs to be intervention studies out there, right, in order for you to develop or come up with the systematic review. That's usually what that criteria is reserved for originally, but not every area that we study has interventions, right?
Yes, which I think is a good point of why an integrative review might be a good type of review to do in nursing or health professions when there's not a lot known on the phenomenon of interest.
Right. So Darren says,
questions?
Darren said that he's having internet trouble, just so you know.
Oh, okay. All right, well, I could show you all what the software looks like that we used in the wounds and dementia study. Let me know if you have any questions. As I mentioned, I don't have a lot of experience in the other types of software, but this is just something for you to see, if you think you might be interested. So I'm logged in with my email and password, and you can see that my reviews. We have the Alzheimer's and Wound Project, and now you could see, and this is where we're done. We're just writing up the findings now. So this is just when we were using it. And so you could see that even though I removed duplicates from EndNote, I still had 9 more duplicates to remove. So the software will help you with that. And then you could see that if we go into title and abstract screening, we had 567 papers that we had to review. And so, and that's, we had always had 2 reviewers review each of them. We had several people on our team who had helped along the way. And because this is a finished review, I can't show you all the functions if we were actually reviewing, but if let's say I still had 100 more to go, it would give me a button to continue my reviews, and I could go in and easily review the abstracts. And then, as I mentioned, team screening, so you could click on that and see who's been working on what. If we were still in the middle of a review, it would tell us how many of the papers still have 1 vote, how many conflicts there are that have to be addressed, and how many are left for a vote. And then once you get through that stage, then you go to the full text screening. And now you can see we had less to do this time. We were down to 176. As I mentioned, since we're done with the review, I can't show all the functionalities, but they have an area where you can extract your own data, but we did not do that. We ended up using Excel. And one reason is because I find it to be a little cumbersome, but I think with the software that time things will change.
So if I could just say some,
Sure.
add a comment about roles, right? So I think when you're putting together a team to do an integrative review, probably one of the most important stages are the people who will be doing the title and abstract reviewing, because if you have folks on your team that may not be content experts, like for instance, this review we had, Elise and Ellen Bass, and they're more looking at this more from an engineering perspective. So Justine and I felt it was easier for the 2 of us who have a little bit more knowledge on the clinical dimensions of what we were looking for to go in and do the first level review on the titles and the abstracts to make sure that we were including really the papers that we were interested in and not like animal models or papers like that. So that is probably critical. And it sounds like there were 567 initial whatever, but it goes really quick once you're in, you read it, you read the abstract and you say added or not added, and it goes very quickly. So it doesn't sound as cumbersome with 560 or so abstracts to review, and it's much easier and it reads better in this software than if you were trying to do it on Medline or PubMed or in CINAHL. So it really is or even in EndNote. So it's much easier on the eyes.
Yeah, agreed. And even though we had search criteria in the databases that we didn't want animal models, somehow some of them still end up in there. And so that's a quick like check. Nope, we don't want this one. So it does go pretty quickly. For at least for stage 1, where you're just looking at titles and abstracts. And the bigger the team you have, the quicker you could get through those as well. And I'm just showing on my screen that with the software, you can put in when you did your search, what your search strategy is, how many reviewers are required to screen each paper. So as I mentioned, you could have one reviewer, but I think for the rigor, you'd want 2 people. There, you could have your inclusion exclusion criteria loaded right into the software. This way, if somebody has a question, they could just look and see what type of paper we wanted in there. We also have that on a Word document so that you could just look on a Word document. Does it belong? Does it not belong? You could tag studies. I haven't done that in this project. I did it on another one. There's just all these additional little things in the software for things that you could do. I agree. I think the software makes it a lot easier than trying to do it in an Excel sheet.
And just to add, we had to get the because this is software, considered software, even though it's online, we had to get this vetted through CNHPIT and make sure that give us permission to purchase a licensing agreement. So it has been vetted if anybody else wants to incorporate this into their research. And I think the PDFs also show up, right?
Yeah, either some of them get imported right away from your reference manager, and then some of them you might have to hand search and add in, especially the harder to reach articles. So we had to make requests to the library to get some of those articles. As I mentioned, it's a finished review, so we can't go backwards, but if we wanted to do data extraction in the software, this is what it looks like. And then you could see when you're doing the review, you could make notes on your papers. So this might be helpful, especially when you have such a large amount. And so like Ellen had a little note about the assessment within that paper. You're able to view the abstracts right in the software. And so that's something that's pulled in from the reference manager. So that's why it's so easy compared to Excel, is that you could look at your screen, you have your title, your abstract, and you could click yes, keep this, no, include, or not sure, and the not sure would move it to the next stage. And then as we were saying, you could have your full text right in here. You can have the PDF. And yeah, I think we used notes pretty generously to keep track of things with the paper, especially if we had team meetings to decide whether we were including it or not including it. The notes section was really helpful to explain, to remind ourselves of what we were thinking when we reviewed the paper. Any other questions or comments?
Thanks, Justine. Sorry, I had a bit of an adventure. My side, on my side, my internet kept dropping in and out, so I'm sorry if I missed a little bit, but I hope everything ran well. There's a question that popped in from Jacelyn. Can you speak to the glitches you encountered with co-evidence?
I don't think that there were many glitches. I mean, the one thing to keep in mind is it's not a strong removing duplicates, and that I just found by Googling, but the software will still tell you if it's a duplicate, some of the duplicates. And so some of them, if we noticed it was a duplicate that still made it in, then we would say no, exclude, and then keep that as a count on our duplicate list. So I think that's one of the glitch of it's not as strong as EndNote removing duplicates. But it's been really easy to use and to navigate. you can export what your findings to several things so that you can, whatever papers you're keeping, you can send that to EndNote. It will actually give you a prism diagram in here, although for our paper, we had to make our own because we ended up excluding even more papers. So not too many glitches. I think it's been really easy to use. I'm just not the biggest fan of the data extraction piece. And so I think that's up to whoever is using the software. There were so many things we wanted to extract from the data that it was cumbersome to do it in here. So this is what it would look like if you were to extract data right into here. So you'd put your setting, country, methods, population. Some people use this just well. It just didn't really work for what our team was looking for.
There's another question that just popped in. First, Jason, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I'm just also using Covidence right now, and I'm having a lot of issues with it and finding a lot of glitches. And but it's mostly in the data extraction, like you said, you weren't using it. So this is my first Cochrane review that I'm working on, and so I've not done it with Excel extraction prior to. So it's nice to hear, Justine, that you do feel like there are some benefits to using this over that. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Great. New question from Cynthia. If you have references from a previous study in your reference manager, does this software give you the chance to select which references you want to import?
I'm thinking through this question. I think that you probably have to somehow start a new library in your reference manager with the ones that you want to select and then upload that file. I think that's probably the best way to go about it.
Great. I see a thumbs up from Cynthia. All right.
Okay.
If there are no additional questions, thank you so much. We'll see our postdocs next Thursday for a private postdoc discussion. Everybody else, thank you so much for joining us.